Hello everybody, my name is Stefán Jökull. I am a senior software engineer at CCP Games, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we defend our players from hackers and how we have evolved account security in EVE Online over the last few years. To begin with, I'm going to tell you a little bit about EVE Online, what it is. EVE Online is a sandbox MMO, and when I say sandbox MMO, I mean that the game does not set players on a predetermined path. They can pretty much do whatever they want. They can decide by themselves what they want to do. Some people like to mine stuff. Other people like to just manufacture or blow other people up. They can be pirates, mercenaries, etc. And the thing that drives all of this is the sort of unique player-driven economy within EVE Online. Most of the economy is entirely player-driven in the sense that players gather the resources by themselves. They sell them to other players who then take them further. This, of course, drives the sort of PvP centricity of the game. The game very much focuses on getting people to fight each other while still cooperating. And this creates what we sort of look at as a high risk versus reward factor. And a big part of that is the fact that in EVE, items can actually be permanently destroyed. So usually, the bigger risk you take within EVE Online, the bigger you actually stand to gain or actually lose as well if it fails. Players create and join corporations to play together. We just don't want them to fight each other all the time. They need to work together as well. So if you've ever played World of Warcraft, this would be the equivalent of guilds. But EVE also takes this a step further and has a thing called alliances. And alliances is an umbrella term for multiple corporations working together towards sort of a bigger goal, and there are in-game mechanics for this. For example, if a group of people wants to control an entire region in space, which might contain multiple systems, they would need an alliance for this because it's very hard to do this with just a group of a few people. There are some interesting facts about EVE Online as well. EVE Online will be 17 this year. It was 16 years old last May. It's launched in 2003. There are not many MMOs out there that have been running for this long, and it is a single shared universe. So people from Australia, people from Russia, United States, UK, pretty much wherever, they're all playing on the same server, able to interact with each other, except for China, because of reasons. They also have to be separate. But everyone else plays on the same server. Around 25,000 players are logged in at any given moment. This also fuels this in-game economy and keeps it running and makes the game interesting pretty much whenever. There are not really any specific high points during these 24 hours when people are playing. And it even has the Guinness World Record for the single biggest PvP battle, where over 6,142 players battled it out for hours. EVE has made headline news on a couple of occasions. One of them is the bloodbath of BR5RB. It's not the easiest name to pronounce, but if you Google this, you will actually get a result saying, and that's where a huge battle actually claimed $300,000 worth of assets being destroyed. And that's the game mechanic that actually makes items be able to be permanently destroyed. And I'm talking 300,000 real-world dollars here. When you boil all of this down into just one thing, it's, of course, that internet spaceship is serious business. And this is why we do our best to keep player accounts from getting hacked. But we need to think about why they get hacked in the first place. That usually boils down to RMT, which is real money trading. This is a thing that plagues many online games today. It's where a group of people or a company decides to put up a website saying, like, we will sell you this amount of in-game currency for $20. Of course, this is usually frowned upon and usually against all of the rules in the game because you're not supposed to be benefiting in a monetary fashion from playing the game. But this is, again, fueled by the in-game economy. So this is sort of if you look at the pros and cons of the huge player-driven economy, this is sort of the con of it, because almost everything that's gathered within the game can be bought or sold in the in-game market. So transferring assets between players is really easy. The in-game currency, which we call ISK, can also be directly transferred between players. Again, this is good to keep a very vibrant economy within the game, but it also makes it easy to liquidate accounts. So an account gets hacked, all of his items get sold, and the ISK is transferred in usually a matter of minutes. But how do these ARM tiers operate? This was actually one of the interesting parts when we started looking at this. They build account lists. They build a list of accounts that they know that they can get into at any given time, usually without the other player knowing. They use credential stuffing attacks for this purpose. We'll go into more details on those later. We've also seen keyloggers. This used to be a much bigger problem than it is today, but it's still a problem. People might want to figure out a way to make something easier. They start Googling, and someone says, hey, you can just download this application, and it just takes care of the mining for you within the game, not realizing that usually these applications tend to contain keyloggers, which is basically part of the program that records every key press you make and sends it off somewhere else. So you've basically given some unknown party all of your information. Phishing attempts happen from time to time as well. We see players getting emails from nefarious actors saying they're contacting them on behalf of CCP and try to get their account details that way. But the interesting part is how they act when they do this, because they gather these huge lists, and we used to think that they would just try to liquidate all of them at once and stash their things somewhere and then just sell them off. But this is not how it works, because if they did, it would be much, much easier to find them. We would just be looking at the account that's pretty much gathering everything. But they wait for the purchase orders to come in, and it's only then that they actually log into the accounts and just liquidate the amounts that they need and ship them off. So they do this very, very quickly. They also utilize payment and reward loopholes. And when I say payment and reward loopholes, I'm talking about, for example, in some countries you can actually use something called direct debit, which is a payment method you can link directly to your bank account. But we might actually not get the final financial statement until days later, and then we would find out that they didn't have enough funds, so they've been playing for 2 or 3 days without really paying anything, and then we have to close their account. They also use reward loopholes. For example, we have reward systems within the game. So if you invite 5 of your friends and they end up as paying customers, we might reward you with some in-game item that's either rare or some other benefit. So of course what the RM tiers do is they just get a list of stolen credit cards, they invite themselves 10 or 15 times, get the rewards, sell them off, and just run away with the profits. Bots are another thing. We want people to be playing the game, not just creating automated bots that do it for them. So they find some mechanic within the game that's easy to script or automate. They create bots to do this, and we will have to figure out how they sort of either have manipulated the game client or done something else to basically be gathering assets without ever doing anything. Now, I got thrown into the deep end. I joined CCP in May 2008, and one of the first things I did was I started working on the billing systems and the account management systems within Eve. And very quickly, I started getting familiar or experiencing these attacks for myself. So the introduction was harsh when you don't know anything about security. CCP was basically just starting out its web development team at that time, and it used to been mostly contractors. So I was seeing for the first time in my career these scripted attacks, credit card frauds happening, and how they were acting. So if I go a little bit into credential stuffing attacks, it's basically iterating through a list of usernames and passwords. Wherever you get that list really doesn't matter, because there are multiple lists out there. They're really not that hard to find. And you just go through this list of a username and password. You find some service, you try logging into it. If it doesn't work, you just try the next one. You continue going on and on and on. And this tends to really work well when you don't have any login throttling, which was the case when I started working. And there is a very simple reason why this even works to begin with, and that is because people reuse passwords. This is probably the biggest factor and the biggest threat to most services out there is the reuse of passwords. So if I would have your username and password, for example, for Facebook, how likely would it be that it would work for your email account as well? It's pretty likely for most people, actually. So shortly after I joined, I saw my first big attack against our systems. And we were looking at web server logs, and all of a sudden, I'm seeing a graph, and I see a huge spike. So I started looking at the spike, seeing what's happening, and it's just post to a login form. And of course, this turned out to be a credential stuffing attack. And we looked at those and saw that they had probably gone through hundreds of thousands of usernames and passwords, and an amazingly high number of those were actually valid. But what actually saved us back then was that a vast majority of these accounts were not active subscribers, so they couldn't log in. Even if the credentials were valid, they couldn't log into the game. So out of all the attempts that they made, and even if there were thousands of results that were actually valid in there, just like a few dozen, I don't think it even got to 100, were actually active accounts. So we didn't have many accounts that we had to go through and notify of being hacked. So it wasn't really, the impact wasn't as big as it could have been. But this was still a problem, and we needed to do something. So we figured out, okay, how can we prevent this from happening? Like, login throttling was one thing. We did that like in a primitive fashion, but we thought we needed to do something more. So we started thinking, and we came up with the character challenge. And this is way back in 2008. And I call this the poor man's 2FA for a reason. We've gotten a question like, why didn't you just use standard 2FA? And the answer is pretty much it didn't exist back then. Google Authenticator as an application, for example, didn't exist until 2010. So we figured, okay, is there something that only the account owner knows besides his username and password that we could ask them about? And we figured that, well, we could ask him for the name of a character on their account, because you create an account and you have to create a character because it's a role-playing game. And usually that character name is something that only the account owner should know. So we came up with this. This was the character challenge, as we called it. So if we saw the player logging in from a new IP address or new location, we would give them this prompt saying, just complete login. Since you haven't logged in from this IP before, please enter the name of one of the characters associated with your account. Seems easy, right? But if you're a hacker and you want to automate this and try this, you, of course, need to try this. Like, the hackers are not going to click the cancel button. So how would they circumvent this logic? First thing they would probably try is to use the username as the character name. And this being a role-playing game where we were not using email addresses as usernames, you had to come up with something. It's very likely that the character you would be creating would be called the same name. Another thing which was really interesting was that we actually saw social engineering where they actually just got customer support to tell them. And this worked primarily because we kind of made a mistake when we deployed this the first time, and we forgot to tell customer support about it. So obviously they were not aware that they were supposed to give out this information, but we fixed that pretty quickly. So we saw them moving over to like the reverse of that, of getting the actual owners to tell them. So they basically contacted the actual owners of the account, if they could, or if they knew who they were, pretending to be CCP employees. But overall, even despite this being flawed, it was actually semi-successful. We saw a drop in the number of accounts that were being hacked. But we needed to do more. So around that same period, we decided to create what we call PLEX. I'll explain a little bit what that is. The objective of this was basically to reduce the demand and the return on investment for the R&T websites to operate. So what they were doing is they were selling in-game assets, or basically ISK, usually in-game currency, for real money. So we figured, okay, can't we just do this as well, by ourselves, legitimately? And to prevent us from devaluing the economy within the game, we had to create something that would stay in the game, something that actually provided value, because we don't want to be creating currency out of nothing. So we created an in-game item that the players could trade between themselves, And this in-game item had this sort of specific ability that you could consume it and extend your subscription. So a new player could come into the game, he could buy a couple of plexes for the same amount that like 2 months of subscription would cost, and he gets this in-game item. And then he can trade that to other players for in-game currency, and those players can then basically extend their subscriptions. So for example, if you're playing EVE and you're very good at generating currency within the game, either by actively playing it, mining or selling stuff, you can actually be playing completely for free by buying plexes of other players. So we managed to keep the value within the game. And this was actually pretty successful because, like I said, this was an economy-friendly way for a new player to get ISK also legitimately. They would not have to give their credentials to a shady third-party website. And this worked really well. We saw the RMP prices go up. We saw account hacking go down. So we had actually stumbled upon something that actually worked. And this is actually still a part of the game today, and has become an increasingly important part of the in-game economy. So things are going good, and EVE is slowly building up. And in 2011, we decided to introduce the EVE single sign-on, the EVE SSO. And the primary driver for this was because over time, new systems get added that require authentication. People needed to be able to log into the account management website with their username and password. They, of course, need to be able to log into the game with their username and password. So we had duplicated authentication logic. And then we add forums, we add customer support sites that need to be able to do the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. And we figured, okay, this is never going to work. We can't be duplicating this logic over multiple systems, so let's create an SSO. So obviously, we need to funnel them through one place. Benefits are obvious, but we needed something to base this on. And again, back in 2011, there were, of course, mechanisms for this, but one was actually really starting to come up quickly, and we saw Facebook and Gmail or Google and more people bring it up, and that's OAuth2. But however, it was still being drafted back then. It was late in the draft stages in 2011, so it was semi-stable, but we thought, okay, this seems to be working well and everyone else picking it up, so let's go with it. For those that might not know what OAuth2 is, if you've ever gone to a mobile device or application or website that says log in with Google or log in with Facebook, you click the link, you get redirected, and they'll say, do you want to log into this website? That's the OAuth2 authentication flow that you're going through right there. So we look at this and we see that, okay, there are very few stable implementations for obvious reasons. This is very new. So we write our own, of course, like you do. And of course, as I see people frowning, you're probably all thinking this, for obvious reasons, because one does not simply write your own authentication mechanism, but we really did our best to do our due diligence here. We tried to, we went over the spec multiple times, we kept up with changes, we even had this audited by third parties. So we were pretty confident in this, being properly done. So there came a time when we had to integrate this, and this is harder than it sounds when you're working for a big company, because, like I said, the forums that we have, the game clients, the customer support sites, everything else, these things add up very quickly. And as it turns out, these things also tend to belong to different teams. And getting every team to do the same thing or getting every manager on board is really not easy, but we actually were pretty successful in convincing the upper management and everyone else that we needed to do this. So it got done. And of course, the immediate benefits were obvious. We had one place to focus our security work, much easier than having 4 places to do it. There was a much faster time to delivery on new security features. We had OAuth token revocation, since we were using OAuth, and OAuth token revocation is a mechanism in OAuth, for example, where you can invalidate the login tokens regardless of where they were generated from. So if a user changes his password or if a user transfers his accounts, we can invalidate his logins on every device or every system that he's been logged into, because that's what you want to do when these things happen. Of course, we were able to do much better login throttling because, like I said, our first attempt was primitive. We tried to keep track of failed logins that would get written to logs. We had to aggregate those all in one place and try to somehow synchronize this between multiple systems, since we had rewritten the authentication logic all over the place. So we were able to just move to a shared counter in just one place in our SSO, and this turns out to be Redis. It's very handy for this. And we were also now in a position that we were able to look at IP addresses and geolocations in a sane way. Like, we wouldn't have to, again, duplicate this logic all over the place, so we started looking at those as well. We try to tweak these as well, because obviously if you, for example, if you're on a campus, someone on the campus decides to just spam the login service with incorrect information, and you would be denying everyone on the campus from being able to log in because it would throttle that IP number. So we try to tweak it with success ratios. Of course, this is never perfect, but it works. Now, since we started looking at locations or IP addresses, we thought, okay, we might be able to use those to our advantage. So we started registering them for users. For example, and we couldn't just use IP addresses, because like in Germany, German ISPs, they like to cycle IP address very aggressively, so you might get a new IP address every day. So if we just used IPs, we would still be prompting the character challenge for every German player ever. So we needed to look at geolocation as well, which we did. So if we spotted you coming from a new IP or geolocation, depending on several parameters, countries, we figured, okay, we will prompt you with a character challenge. Similar to just how 2FA works today. If you go to a new device, you will get prompted for the 2FA code, but you probably won't be prompted for it every time. Then things are working for a long time, and we move on to other projects, but then we start looking at things again. So in 2015, we actually decide to implement 2FA properly, for good reason, because we could then replace the character challenge. The character challenge, like I said, wasn't perfect. It had its flaws. We had numerous support tickets where people were contacting customer support because they'd simply forgotten their character names. So it was annoying to a lot of people. So now we actually have something that we can do properly. So we did that. We used email as fallback. So if you didn't have the Authenticator app in your mobile device, we would be able to just send you an email with the verification code instead, and you would just open up your email and look at it there. It was cumbersome for a player with many accounts, and the Eve is special in that regard that a lot of players have many accounts. We have a lot of big-time players that have dozens of accounts. We even have a few that have hundreds. I don't know why, but they do. So you can imagine that if you enable 2FA in all your accounts and you have to start scrolling through your mobile device to find the right one, it's going to be annoying. So this kept the adoption low. Even if we did get some adoption, like people liked this better than the character challenge, it still wasn't perfect, but better than nothing. Then something interesting happened. In 2016, Eve goes free to play. This is a pretty big milestone in the history of Eve, because we're basically opening the floodgates at this point. So a subscription is no longer required to play the game. Basically means that there's a reduced set of features for non-subscribers, but they can still log in. They're not denied login. So we look at this and try to figure out what that means for account security. And it didn't really take us long to figure this out. The accounts that were credential stuffed years ago, but we dismissed because they weren't active subscribers. We didn't have to think about them. That was 8 years before we go free to play. So what do we do about those? And that's even if we have the list anymore, 8 years later. These people can all log in again. We're aware of that fact. And what about credential stuffing attacks that we might have missed? And this is a pretty big problem when you actually think about this. So we were going through solutions of what we could do, but pretty much everything we thought of would have pretty big customer impact. We even, at one point, we even thought about if we should just reset the password for everyone, regardless of if they had been attacked or not. But obviously, when you're launching a game to be free to play, this would be a horrendous experience. The first thing that every existing player had to do was go through a password reset process. So we didn't go with that, but we did decide on a solution at one point. So we ended up going the same route as SteamGuard does. If you've ever played a game on Steam, which is a game publishing platform, you get this prompt whenever you go to a new device or a new location that says, like, we've sent a verification code to your email address, you have to type that in to finish your login. And then usually you can continue logging in on that device without like further hassles. So we figured, okay, this works for them. They're a huge publishing platform, so this must do what it has to do. And what do we have to do? Well, to be able to send emails, you need verified email addresses for this to be reliable in any way. And this was sort of our first stumbling block because we didn't require valid email addresses at that point in time. So we figured, okay, the first thing we would have to do is basically block those people that don't have verified email addresses from logging in, and send them a verification email, and they have to click a link. And then they can continue logging in. All good. The list of safe IPs that we had, we figured at this point that this wasn't really reliable. Successful credential stuffing attacks, others might have basically polluted that list with a lot of bad entries. So we figured, okay, we just have to scrap this and pretty much present this to everyone the first time they log in. Was better than resetting all their passwords. Step 3 is then send the two-factor verification codes for verification, and then we can actually start building a new safe list for people and like set device cookies, because we were learning more stuff back then. So this is all well and good. This got accepted, and we started working on this. So we came up with this beautiful prompt, very similar to the SteamGuard thing. It basically says, complete login, please enter the verification code we just sent to your email address. If you do not receive the email within 30 minutes, please contact customer support. This went through a lot of testing. We went through a lot of like user experience tests to make sure that everything was running, and everyone was really happy with this. So, of course, when Eve goes free to play at the same time, we deploy this same feature. Obviously, it wasn't perfect. And since I'm showing you this image, obviously something went wrong, and it actually caught us completely by surprise. If you think about it, it shouldn't be surprising, but it's a little bit nuanced. We first had to verify all the email addresses that weren't verified. That means sending an email with a link that you have to click. Then we have to send the verification codes. That's another email with a code that you have to read. So this was a very big change in email sending behavior coming from our domain. And what does that mean? Is that a big deal? Well, when you're going from like hundreds or maybe a couple of thousand emails per day up to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, because now everyone wants to play the game at the same time, email services tend to find that suspicious because they're suddenly seeing a huge spike of emails coming from your domain. So what do? They're not sure, so let's just delay the emails. Let's see what happens if we don't deliver the emails immediately. So they got delayed for up to 48 hours, which is obviously a problem when you're sending verification codes that are valid for 30 minutes. So we contact them saying, okay, what can we do? We contact our email provider, which was Salesforce at that point. We get pretty much the same response for all of them. We're sorry, you're just gonna have to wait until our systems start recognizing this new heuristic as something that's normal again. And this overall took about 2 weeks. Like some providers were like much quicker to accept this, and some took up to 2 weeks. So in the midst of launching the game as a free-to-play game and launching all the new security features, we had to basically scramble to find like manual workarounds for customer support to use so people could actually log into the game. But despite this, which ultimately resolved itself, we needed to take a look at if it worked or not. And amazingly, it actually did. And the increase in account takeovers was absolutely minimal compared to the increase in logins. And the increase in logins was actually quite huge. So we were really happy to see that this worked, and this is actually still there today. Another benefit was that now we had validated emails for all of our active players, which for obvious reasons is something that you want to have. It makes for a much more reliable communication channel instead of trying to communicate with a username that you don't know if even responds to an email address. But what happened as a result of this was that our customers' actual email accounts became much bigger targets, because now you need access to those to be able to hack the accounts. And we saw an increase in account takeover attempts where people were perhaps like going to a machine that hadn't been logged out and opening the account management website and seeing them just change the email address and save it. And once you change the email address, you get a link sent to the new address, which is probably the hacker's address anyway. So we figured, okay, this is not going to work. So we decided to harden the email change process as well. We were a bit on the fence about this, like what impact it would have. But we needed to prevent these account takeovers. We didn't want them just to be able to change the email address and get ownership of the accounts, because then they could just reset the password anyway and create their own, and they've basically locked the legitimate user out of their accounts. So what we did is we decided to require verification on both the old and the new address before we actually persist the change. So if you go to the account management website and change the email address, we will send an email to the old one and the new one, and you have to click the links in both of them to actually persist the change. We weren't sure how people would react to this, if this would be too much of a hassle, but this has actually worked pretty well, and friction was surprisingly low. We expected there to be a lot more friction to this than there was. But in the end, it did what it had to do. And then we moved on. So how many of you have seen this website? Probably all of you, right? This is a website created by Troy Hunt. He has a few talks here at NTC. I really recommend you see them. And on this website, you can actually look up your email address and see if it's been part of a data breach. But there's another feature that this website has that, in my opinion, too few people know about, and that is pwned passwords. You can actually look up passwords or password hashes and see if these passwords have been used in a data breach or have been part of a data breach. And just to read the description for you, it says pwned passwords are 555 million real-world passwords previously exposed in data breaches. This exposure makes them unsuitable for ongoing use, as they're at a much greater risk of being used to take over other accounts. So, seems like a perfect fit. But like most providers and most authentication mechanisms, we do things properly. We salt and hash our passwords, so we can't check them beforehand. So we need to be able to utilize this in some way. So we decided to integrate this into our SSO in May 2018. And we do this by, like during login, that's pretty much the only point at which we have your actual password, not just a hash representation of it. After we verified the password, we will then send it, or not send the actual password itself, we will use k-anonymity to check that the password does not exist on this list. So what do we do? For example, if you'll be using this password, it's great. It's got like an uppercase, lowercase, it's got symbols, numbers. Great password, right? Fits all the requirements. Don't use this password, by the way. It's horrible for reasons that I'm going to come into in a minute. We take the hash of this password. And this is the hash that gets generated, the SHA-1 hash. And I want to point out the blue and the green parts. The blue part, just the 5 first characters of the password, is what we use in just a standard HTTP GET request to the pwned passwords API. So we're not sending the full hash of the password, we're just sending a very small subset of it, basically to prevent anyone from using, for example, a reverse lookup table or a rainbow table to see what the actual password is. And we get back a result that contains 500 line-separated suffixes, that's the green parts. So we go through these lines in the response and see if we can find the green part in there. And if we find the green part in there, we know that this password is unsuitable for use because it has been part of a data breach. And after the green part, you see a number, 52,579. That's the number of times this particular password, using an @ symbol instead of the A and 0 instead of the O, 52,579 is the times that this password has appeared in data breaches. So that's why you should never use this particular password. If the hash matches, we can notify the user that his password is insecure, which we do. But you don't really want to just blast this in the user's face. You don't want to say, like, your password has been hacked. That's not the messaging that you want to give during the login process. So you need to turn this into some sort of an educational step. So we do not, for example, force people to change their password or block their login, even if their password is bad. But we display a messaging to them that makes sense, because we do not want them to panic either. We do not want them to think that we've been hacked, even if their password has been used in a data breach elsewhere, because we haven't. So we display a notification. And that notification just says, like, security warning, commonly used password, and like just some frequently asked questions, like, what, has my account been compromised? Probably not, but this increases the risk of your account being compromised because your current password appears at least once in a list of known commonly used passwords. So what should you do? Keep your account secure. We highly recommend that you go to the account manager website and change your password, as well as enable two-factor authentication for your account. And we also recommend you familiarize yourself with modern password practices, et cetera, et cetera. And we also go on to explain that we were able to check your password without knowing it because, well, we knew it during login, but we normally don't know what your password is, and we do not share your passwords with anyone. And this has actually been very, very well received by players. But when we launched this, we saw some very interesting statistics out of this. Around 17 to 19% of all of our logins had insecure passwords. And this means that 1 out of every 5 or every 6 people has a bad password. And that's just for Eve. And our players tend to be like tech savvy and maybe more security aware than most people. So I would think that this number is actually higher for a lot of services out there. But after we actually deployed this feature, this currently fluctuates around 9 to 12%. There are still a few places that we haven't been able to prevent people from using or like creating accounts with these bad passwords, but we're working on eliminating them. This means that we have seen a 40% reduction in the use of unsecure passwords for you online, which is huge when you think about it, especially for a product that is dealing with account hacking in general. So to give you an example and just give you some sort of numbers to actually work with, during September 2019, we had 245,000 unique user pass logins. Before we implemented I Been Pwned, that would mean that we had around 40,000 usernames that would have been using insecure passwords. After this deployment, or after this fix, we can safely say that at most 30,000 of those have pwned passwords. So just for 1 month, we've actually prevented 10,000 accounts from having a bad password. But we decided to continue. This wasn't all we did. We also started using some of the built-in browser security features, which in my mind also way too few people know about. Content security policies is one of them. This allows you to pretty much whitelist JavaScript images and CSS that runs in your websites. So let's say, for example, that you were using a third-party JavaScript library you embed on your website. If someone hacks that third-party JavaScript library and you don't have a content security policy in place or something that checks for the validity of it, you've basically opened the floodgates for malicious script to run on your website. We are also able to whitelist URLs for network requests so we can prevent exfiltration of data via JavaScript, for example. And then we moved on to HSTS, which is strict transport security. This is, in its simplest form, this is just an HTTP response header that says or tells the browser to just load the site over HTTPS, never load it over HTTP. And this, when properly implemented, allows you to put or submit your domain to what's called the HSTS preload list. The HSTS preload list is basically just a list of domain names that gets hard-coded into browsers, modern browsers today, to only load over HTTPS. So even if you've never visited eveonline.com or login.eveonline.com, and you type HTTP into the browser URL bar, the browser will intercept it and just change it to HTTPS. So you will never send a single request over HTTPS in a modern browser today. This, of course, prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. We use report URI as well. This is another built-in browser feature where you can actually get reporting from browsers sent to you or a service if you sign up for those, but you can just receive those reports yourselves. And those are generated by the browser, for example, when it hits a CSP violation. If it tries to load a script that it wasn't supposed to load according to the CSP, it will send like a small JSON object to an endpoint that you define. So you can catch CSP violations. It also has network errors. So if, let's say that you have a bad load balancer somewhere and it's cutting off requests, you might get a report sent from browsers because of network errors. You might see a spike in those. And another very interesting thing is deprecations. So if you're using JavaScript or CSS that's about to be deprecated, maybe it hasn't been deprecated yet, modern browsers, for example, like Chrome, will say that, will send a report to the URL that you define saying that, hey, on this website you are using JavaScript, it will be deprecated in like a 2 versions time. So that's a really, really good thing to use as well. So we continued. Last year we also decided to collaborate with 1Password, basically giving all of our players a free 6-month trial of 1Password. There were no catches involved. People could just sign it up, try it out for 6 months. If they didn't like it, they weren't forced to use it. It's not tied to the Eve account in any way. Even if you would put all your passwords in there and you decided to stop using it, the password manager just turns read-only if you stop subscribing to it, so you can still use it, but you just can't add new ones. So this was very well received as well, because there's no way that you can actually manage passwords today for hundreds of websites without using a password manager, not unless you have some sort of a predictable pattern to creating your passwords, which is bad in and of itself. But along with the 1Password integration, we decided to improve the 2FA experience, and we enabled sharing of the 2-factor authentication seed between accounts. It's of course less secure than having a unique one, but it's better than not using 2FA at all, of course. So this simplified the process for people with multiple accounts. They could just use the same generated code for all their accounts. Like I said, less secure than using a separate one, but better than not having 2FA at all. This increased adoption immediately. And just to give you sort of a sense of the scope as well here, if we look at every Eve account that has logged in since the game launched, not just accounts created, but people that have actually logged into the game, then 0.7% of those have 2FA enabled, understandably, because the game launched in 2003 and we only launched 2FA in 2015. Since 2FA was introduced, this number jumps to 2.6%, and that's if I'm looking at accounts that have logged in since we enabled 2FA. Since we launched the I Been Pwned integration, this number jumps to 5.6%, and that's a pretty big part of that is the messaging that we give to users, telling them, saying, hey, you have a bad password, you should change it, but you should also enable 2-factor authentication. And then if we look at just like the last 3 months, this jumps to 9.7%. And that actually puts us on par with a lot of services out there, because we used to be below them because of the, what would I say, like multiple account friction. But we're actually getting into the same levels that a lot of other services out there have. I would, of course, like to see this percentage much higher, and there are actually ways to do that we're currently looking at. But this is good. There are a lot of more ideas on the drawing board looking at all of these changes. So we're not nearly done yet, but we're, of course, continuously iterating on this. So if I summarize this up into some of the key learnings that we've had during this time, providing a similar service as RMT has helped a lot. Of course, that doesn't apply to everything. It mostly applies to something like games, or where you have some sort of economy going that might be exploited. Then finding a way to provide the same service legitimately and without devaluing what you already have will help, definitely. Because people will, if they have a legitimate way of doing this, they will rather go for that than the illegitimate one. Verifying email addresses. Obviously, this is incredibly valuable for customer support. We actually didn't realize its value until we really started seeing the benefits of this. Like, we just gotten used to not everyone validating their email addresses. Security training is important. I really can't stress this enough. We can all go Google for a lot of things, learn about security, but will that actually teach us what we need to know to implement it or really understand how it works? And security training is really the best thing that you can do to teach your developers how to do this and how to do this properly. Even if it's just a subset of the developers just generating interest in security in general, is really, really important for pretty much any online service that's running today. there are a lot of powerful free tools out there. To increase the security of your application, you're not forced to buy an expensive product. Of course, you have to spend development time. That's a given. But you're not forced to buy an expensive product or going through some very expensive hoops to increase the security, because there are a lot of free tools out there. The browser tools that I mentioned is one of them. I Been Pwned is another one. And using these tools, it actually usually catches everyone by surprise in how effective they are. Educating and guiding users is another thing. This is exceedingly important as well, and is very underutilized in our industry today, because even if you would just give people a link or a very small explanation on how they should create their passwords or why they should turn on two-factor authentication, just doing that increases the adoption. And increasing the adoption of this, both people picking passwords, people using 2FA, is better for the industry as a whole. Because with every data breach, the pool of usernames and passwords just gets bigger. Encouraging and incentivizing 2FA. 2FA is without a doubt the very best method anywhere, really, that you have today to keep your account secure. If you don't have, for example, 2FA enabled on your email account, I would highly suggest that you do, because it's been basically proven again and again through numerous research studies that just the fact of enabling 2FA deters a lot of people from actually hacking into accounts, and it exponentially increases or decreases the risk of your account being hacked. Incentivizing is another part. We haven't properly started incentivizing this yet, and by incentivizing I mean we've seen products, for example, give users a discount of their subscription prices by just enabling 2FA. It's very good, because 2FA is there's always friction involved. You're adding an extra step for users to log in, and people tend to not like extra steps. So if you can give them something in return, it will definitely increase the adoption of 2FA. So that's something that you should utilize if you can. So those are pretty much the key learnings that we have. This is pretty much our ride through account security in Eve. We're constantly learning. We're trying to learn new stuff. So that's pretty much free. If you have any questions, ask away. If you can't think of any right now, that's my Twitter handle, so don't hesitate to contact me there. So if you have any questions, go ahead. Yeah.
With regards to account takeovers, have you looked at session stealing or sessions being stolen as well, since you now have a single point of authentication, or isn't that really, that is out of scope?
So the question is, have we looked at session hijacking to prevent account takeovers? Yes, we actually do our best to prevent that. We tend to use, we only use secure cookies. We try to use same-site cookies where we can, strict security, just to prevent at least that factor. The HSTS preload thing is a big factor there as well, because you want to cut out man-in-the-middle attacks, so HSTS is important as well. So yeah, that's what we think of, and we try to keep up. Anyone else?
Have you guys considered changing out your single sign-on implementation for a third-party one, something like identity server?
So the question is, have we thought about replacing our SSO with another product like identity server? Yes, we have. When you have an SSO that's been running for this long, it's not easy. Never is. But yes, we are continuously looking at that, because obviously we don't want to maintain our own implementation, because as time goes on, it becomes more time consuming to keep up. So we're definitely looking at options, yes.
What security features do you have in the pipeline that you're excited about?
So the question is, what security features do we have in the pipeline that we're excited about? Web authentication is a big part of that. I could say it's in the pipeline, but I can't give a firm estimate, because we have technical restrictions in place, for example, to properly utilize it. But web authentication, one of them, you being able to use biometrics, YubiKeys, FIDO2 compatible devices, that's definitely something that we want to be able to use. So that's one thing. Doing proper two-factor authentication, like incentives, that's another thing as well. It's hard to convince, for example, marketing that you wouldn't want to give people discounts without getting anything in return. So it becomes a hard sell, but I hope we're getting there. Anyone else? All right. Guess that's it for me then. Thank you very much.